Welcome to the Market Mystics podcast. I'm Joshua.
I'm Kim. Let's dive in. Welcome back, everybody.
Welcome.
I'm going to let Josh introduce the topic today.
Thanks.
I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. I hope so anyway. We haven't pre-talked about it much, so we'll see where it goes.
That's true. Yeah, so we were talking about what to record today, and we were engaging the Father, and this sort of a conversation I've been having with myself came up. And I was like, oh, well, like, I think that could be an interesting conversation. It's something, yeah, it's just something that's been on my mind. So I think it could be an interesting conversation. And it's sort of the concept of deciding when it's time to sacrifice something, and I don't mean sacrifice as in like it's a pain or a challenge, but I see it more like trading it in. Like whether it's an identity or something you're working on or whatever it is, like when is it time to trade it in for something different versus are you setting it down because it got tough and you just decided to quit? And I think that's a really interesting, I think it could be an interesting conversation because there's a lot of nuance in that. And there's a lot of, I think you could over spiritualize it to some extent. Like you could make anything like, oh, I'm sacrificing this to God. And it was really something he gave you for you to do. And so, yeah, I think that's interesting. And then, so after I shared with Kim that was what was on my mind, you made the comment of like what God was showing you is just sometimes it's hard to tell where you're at on the mountain of going up into oneness and coming down and whatever. But I think that ties in really well to this conversation because part of going up is sacrificing things that you've carried so that you can reach the next higher point.
For sure. Do you want to I have this problem where I don't say to. Do you want to explain the ascending descending the mountain thing a little bit? I know it's been in lots of the other episodes, but if you're listening to this as a freestanding episode, maybe that would be some good background.
Yeah. So the concept is just we live at the bottom of a mountain, and as mystics, we're called to climb the mountain into oneness. And part of going up the mountain is shedding identities and just things, whatever it may be, that are hindering you from reaching the top of the mountain. And so sometimes you have to set stuff down to get to the top of the mountain. And then you reach the top of the mountain and you're in oneness and everything's great. And then you start descending because we're called to come down here and make a change in this part in the earth. And so you start coming down, and as you're coming down from the correct source of supply, Father starts giving you identities and tasks and things to carry that are needed here. And so in my mind, the sacrifice versus giving up or whatever we want to call it, like going up the mountain, sometimes it's necessary to sacrifice it. And I think coming down the mountain with the things, if you decide to set it down, that's giving it up because it felt heavy to carry. And so to me, it's sort of the same conversation, like decide, can you determine where you're at on the mountain? Because that determines a little bit of like is it sacrificing, trading it in for something better, or is it, I can't carry this anymore, I'm going to set it down?
Like, is it a burden or is it a laying it down for a time?
Hmm.
I think I think this is a really interesting conversation because I'm in that place where I don't know if I'm ascending or descending. I'm just going to be really honest. And I think so much of this is connected with relationship with the Lord. And I've been in a really funny place with that lately. Like things shifted maybe like a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, and how I hear from the Lord and how our relationship is. And it still feels really like uh uncomfortable and different to me. You know what I mean? Like I had gotten to the place where I was so comfortable in how we interact and how I hear from him and how I seek him and how I spend time with him and like just the interaction there. And then now it's different. And so I feel a bit more lost and unsure of like what I'm hearing or not hearing or if I'm ascending or if I'm descending and those kinds of things. So I think this
Mm-hmm.
is a super interesting concept. And you know what we've talked about before? I think we talked about this. It was because I watched this movie about the need for sacrifices and if it's still a thing. But really, how I would look at this is like, can you lay something down? Can you trade in something, lay it down, walk away um, for the sake of giving it to the Lord? So I think I see it in two different areas. So one is going before the Lord and laying something that is precious to you down and giving it to him. Oftentimes it's like a trade and he'll give you something better.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I also see it as like taking it off on the way up the mountain on that ascent. Like there are things that you have to lay down, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not coming back.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know which one we're talking about.
Yeah. And I think something that complicates it slightly more is sometimes we've talked about the journey up and down the mountain in a way that my mind thinks of it as being this long process, but I think it's something we're supposed to do daily, like, and maybe even multiple times a day, like setting down things and saying, okay, I'm going into a place of oneness where I'm not Josh, I'm not like a co-host on the Market Mystics, like I'm ascending into the the unity of all of creation with my father, and then coming back down. Like I think that process probably should be a daily process of, even if it's 30 seconds that you spend doing that, like maybe it's an hour, maybe it's 30 seconds or anywhere in between or whatever. Like I think it could be, that could be part of a daily, yeah, a daily journey. But then there's other aspects of that where in a very real way it is a longer process because it is your life that you're talking about. And so I think there are some aspects of it where it's, even in the moment, like, okay, I got to let that go. Like someone said something to me, and am I going to take that as my identity, or am I going to, like, nope, okay, I'm letting that go, going to sit in oneness for a second, and then I'm going to come back down and like respond to their comment or whatever. Like, I think that that's part of what complicates the question is, um how often is this, are you doing this and are you sitting in that place? And um yeah, and so there's some things in my life that I'm currently asking God that question about. Like, is this something that I'm supposed to be holding on to? Is this something you gave me, or do I need to set it down? And I think, there's part of me that's like, oh, if I set it down, I can never pick it up again. But it's really not true, because oftentimes when you give something to God, He gives you something very similar back, but maybe with a little different twist to it. And so it's not even like it has to be a permanent thing. Um, but can you uh, can you be obedient enough? I don't even know if it's obedient, because I don't know that he's always asking. I think he's just willing to help you step to a next level.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Hmm. I I don't know. I wonder about some of this. And one of the examples I use all the time, and but 'tis the season, why not bring it up again, is
Mm.
Christmas a few years ago. Um, I think we kind of went through this around the same time. Um, the Lord really asked us to put down Christmas, like lay it down, don't pick it up. Right. And
Hmm.
it was going up this mountain, and it was like a pretty hard conviction, at least for me. Like, you are not to have a Christmas tree. You are not celebrating Christmas. Don't act like it's about the birth of Jesus. Like, and it is a hard pill to swallow when you grow up in Christian America. And these things are being stripped away, I suppose. And it was an option. Like, obedience is always an option, right? Like, it's not, there might be a demand, but you have the will to either comply or not. So it was a laying down of that, and it was a stripping off of it as we ascended this mountain. And then, and this was I would call this a long process. I'm sure there are longer ones. I'm sure I'm still like 2 feet up the mountain on other things, but um, just last year, so it was like 2 years of no Christmas, like cut and dry, none. And last year, all of a sudden, I had like freedom for it. And I was like, whoa, Lord, what's going on? And he's like, you can do it or not do it. Like, I've taken you through the process. You're on your way back down the mountain. You can either pick it up or not pick it up. And I did pick it back up. I also have children who really love Christmas, and they've gone through this with me. And it's an interesting dynamic. I'm just side note. It's an interesting dynamic to go through these things when you have a family who may not be going through the same process.
Yeah.
But when you're given the grace to be able to go through this, and they do it with you anyway,
Mm.
like, ooh, what an honoring thing. Anyway, so we picked it back up, and it's fine. Like, it's totally fine, but it also doesn't feel the same as it did before, even though it kind of looks exactly the same. So that was like the ascent and the descent. Um, but I also know there are things that I've had to put down on the way up that are like, I haven't picked up again.
Mm.
And I don't know if that will come later in the journey, or if there are some of those things that just simply get laid down and they stay there, you know? And I do think there are things in our identities that this happens with. And I think this is kind of what you're talking about, right?
Hmm.
Um, and that's hard, because it's not just laying down a thing, it's laying down a part of yourself.
Right.
And I think sometimes there are parts of ourselves that we've created ourselves outside of the Lord. I mean, just to be honest, I don't know, like a couple years ago, I left my corporate job. I was in bookkeeping and accounting in the auto industry. And I laid that down, but that was a part that I just kind of wound up in. That wasn't a part of my identity that the Lord said, Kim, you are a bookkeeper, right? Although I do like to take notes, so maybe I'll have to chew on that a little bit. But uh anyway, there are things that you lay down, and sometimes it's stuff you've created for yourself, and it doesn't matter so much. Like, it's not hard for me to lay down being a bookkeeper. That doesn't feel like stripping away something painful. But there are also other things that you wind up with that you lay down that are difficult. And I think some of them are things you have put in place, but also I think there are times when the Lord has you in a season of identity, right? And he has told you, you are this. But if he can tell you, you are this, can he not also shift that? And even in leveling up, and it is a painful process. I'm not going to pretend like this is like all fun and games. Sometimes maybe it is for people. I've not really experienced super fun times with the stripping away.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes he'll strip some of that away, you know? And I mean, I was telling you earlier that my relationship looks way different with him in the last year and a half than it ever has before. And it's uncomfortable because it just doesn't function the same way. I don't feel like he's far away. I actually feel like he's closer, but it's harder to figure out. Like, I had this thing, like I would just go and I would meet him face to face and I would like stand side by side with him, and just, I had a process, right? And that is how I interacted with him, and it has shifted. But because it's shifted, just because that has been laid down and functioning that way, doesn't mean that this isn't as good or better. It doesn't. It just sometimes is hard.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes with those identities, there are things that he gives us. Sometimes it's stuff we give ourselves, but there are things that he will give us that then have to be leveled up. And so it will feel like a stripping away of that. And then you're either picking up something different or it's looking different when you pick it back up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I, you said something really important, I think, where you said Christmas feels different now. And to me, that points directly to uh, the place you're putting it at.
Mm.
And like I think that this could be easily applied to anything that becomes an idol to us. And I'm not saying like Christmas necessarily became an idol to you, but if it becomes something that's so important, you have to do it this way. And this is like, to some extent, that is an idol. Like
Right.
you're putting it in a place it probably shouldn't be. And so letting it go for a little while, if nothing else, is like fasting. It's
That's
like
true.
fasting is like saying food doesn't own me. Or if you're fasting your phone, it's my phone doesn't own me. You are rightly ordering things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think fasting is part of that. Like uh it fasting is a tool you can use to help you rightly order things. And so it's just interesting. Like it was almost like for a couple of years you were fasting Christmas so that it now you could hold it in a place where it's enjoyable and fun and good to be with family, but isn't like out of line. It's not in a place it shouldn't be. And that to me feels like, yeah, that's exactly like source of supply is something we talk about all the time. Like, can you hold an identity in a correct order and in a correct source of supply, or even an activity? Like, Christmas isn't necessarily an identity. Maybe for some people it is. But I was just recently, this just a side topic, but I went to, my niece was in a ballet performance and there was a guy there who was dressed up like Santa and, was greeting all the kids. And this dude had a beard down to his chest, and it was a real beard. It wasn't a fake Santa beard. It was real. And I'm like, that man lives, Santa, so that every December he can be the real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty amazing. Like I was impressed by his beard. Um, but anyways,
Maybe he
like
just
that's
did no shave November.
yeah, no, it
Like he
was
just has like
for a couple
excessively.
Novembers. It was a couple Novembers. Um, yeah. So I just think like that is that piece of it of how does it feel to you isn't a really important thing. And sometimes you don't know that answer until you've set it down for a minute.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why Christmas now can feel different for you, is because all of a sudden, like all of a sudden it wasn't just like, oh, I grew up and we celebrate Christmas, or this is what we do every year. It was like, no, I'm intentionally going to set this aside for a moment.
Yeah.
And then can I hold it, and does it feel different, or does it feel like, oh no, this still has me again?
Yeah. So can we dig in a little deeper?
Hmm.
Would you be willing to share a little bit about some of the things that feel like are at the place of either laying down, giving up, trading in,
Yeah.
uh, sacrificing any of those things? And uh, what does that feel like?
Hmm. Yeah. So, like, I mean, what stirred this conversation is just um, like, I've traded on the stock market for mm, like 8 years ish, something like that. Um, and have really enjoyed it, and have sort of like made that like it feels like a piece of who I am almost to some degree. And but I'm at a moment in my life where like I need a few things to change and shift around. And so that's one of the things that I'm weighing of, is that something that I continue to hold and pursue, or is that one of the things that gets like sacrificed or set to the side? And it's kind of a like it's a tough thing to figure out a little bit, because that's something that mm, I would say didn't naturally come. Like it wasn't like I woke up as a 3-year old and was like, wow, I want to be a stock trader. Like, no, I wanted to be a cowboy, but I'm allergic to horses, and so that was tough. Um, but it was, it was something that I, to some degree, feel like the Lord put in my hands. But that doesn't mean that He's not ever going to ask for it back. And so I think that that's something that I'm currently weighing. There's others, but that's one thing that's on the front of my mind at the moment. And it's like it it feels a little bit scary to be like, can I set these things aside that I have so enjoyed for a while,
Mhm.
and not actually know, do I get to pick it back up or not? I mean, I think about, and I don't want to say that like God is telling me you must do this. I feel like He's given me choice in what I do. But I think about like Abraham, when God tells him to sacrifice his promised son. Like, Abraham, I'm going to make you a father of many nations. And years and years and years, and finally he gets this child, and he's like, this is where it's going to come from. And then God's like, okay, go kill your son. And the obedience to take him up the mountain put him on the altar, and start the process. And then God's like, wow, okay, here you go. I'm going to upgrade you. Here's a ram you can use instead of your son.
Mm-hmm.
And like, thank you for showing me that didn't own you. And like, I don't want to get into the theology of that story because it's kind of a strange story to me, but like that is a that I think that is something to aspire to be at the level where God gives you a promise. God gives you what you would probably see as the fruit of that promise. And then God says, put that down.
Yeah.
Like, are you gonna, do you trust God enough to do that? And I think that's a big thing for me is like, I really enjoy those things that I do. Do I trust God to give me something better if I give that to him?
Mm. It's really good. I mean, I think you were talking about this earlier and how things can become idols, right?
Mm.
And you also talked about source of supply. And I think about that story with Isaac and Abraham. And there was this promise from God that this would happen. It happened, and then he enjoyed it so much. And then he was asked to give it up. And I think it was something that either had become or was at risk of becoming an idol and taking the place of the father as that source of
Mm.
supply, right? So is Isaac the source of the joy, the source of the faith, the source of the well-being, the source of
Mm-hmm.
life, those things? And so he, like, literally, we're talking about up and down the mountain. I hadn't even thought about this story in reference to this at all, but literally take him up the mountain, lay him down on the altar for the sake of being one with the Father.
Mm-hmm.
And was he willing to do that? He was. And then Father let him pick him back up and bring him back down the mountain. And I think that's some of the stuff that we're talking about. And it doesn't have to be some like mind boggling idol that everyone would think you're such a terrible person about. It could be freaking anything. Like, I could just give up coffee. He could
Yeah.
just ask me to put coffee down
Mm-hmm.
because it's supplying something that I'm holding too dearly to,
Yeah.
and I I think back to this, there's like this pivotal moment in my faith walk. And it was, maybe it was before, maybe it was just near the beginning of when I was starting to engage heaven and like kind of operate differently in my faith. But there was one day that I was just sitting with the Lord, and he said the most bizarre thing to me. He said, okay, we're coming to a turning point. And I need to know, are you going to obey at all costs, or you can keep going on living like you have been, kind of status quo, and um, there will still be fruit, but you won't have the depths.
Mm.
And it was like a real option. It wasn't rhetorical.
Mm-hmm.
And it felt like uh, asking for sacrifice. And it almost felt like asking for a sacrifice of my own will. Like, and that's what it sounds like now as I'm saying it. And maybe that's what it was. But along the way, so that is the option that I chose, was like, I will do whatever you ask me to do, I'll say yes, even
Mm-hmm.
if it's hard. Like, I want that. I want the depths. I want to continue to level up. I want to go up the mountain. I don't want this to be just level ground for the rest of my life.
Right.
And But I think along the way, he asked me a question that felt like a big sacrifice. But now along the way, he's shown me that truly his will is my will and my will is his will. But it took going through developing the relationship and going up and down some mountains and putting some things down and picking them up to see that it wasn't the sacrifice that it felt like then. I can now look back on and see wasn't actually asking for anything different than what I actually wanted anyway. Like it wasn't actually giving up my will. You know what I mean? And it's kind of an interesting thing because I think sometimes when you wind up being able to level up in some of the maturity and responsibility, authority, whatever relationship with him, things that you saw one way before will wind up being revealed to be something completely different than what you thought they were. So like that, like I was looking at it in such a one-dimensional, self-focused way, the question, but he knew that because that's where I was, right? Mm-hmm. And now I look at it and I'm like, it's the best invitation I've ever had. Like, awesome. Oh. This is terrific, but it felt like a sacrifice at the time, you know? And I think sometimes when there are those things that do feel like it's this huge piece of us that we're being asked to put down, or that is necessary to put down in order to continue climbing the mountain, it can feel devastating and it can feel even debilitating because maybe that's been your walking stick. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But I think that what's at the top and what's on the way down and what is even at the bottom of the mountain, once you get back down there, you'll be surprised at how much better it is, or how different you can see it because you've been able to level up with it.
Yeah. I think that's a great statement.
Yeah. It doesn't make it easy.
No, it's not.
None of this is easy.
It's not an easy process, but I think trust comes through relationship. And I think some of the reason that Abraham was willing to obey is because he had seen God come through for him. He developed some trust, developed some relationship. And he also just kind of had that, like, I don't know, grit or whatever you want to call it, where it was like, no, actually, I'm going to do this whether or not it feels good or not, because I have this level of trust built up. I have this equity with God that, like, I'm going to obey no matter what. Mm-hmm. And I think the big thing for me is figuring out, like, the whole point of this conversation is like, and I just need to sit with myself and with God and really have this conversation. Mm-hmm. But is figuring out, is this obedience or is this, it's hard, so I'm going to put it down. Like, I think that's in all of these things. Like, probably in the case of Abraham and Isaac, it's pretty clear. Like, he wasn't trying to kill Isaac because, oh, this was too hard to carry. That's probably not true. But there are other times, I think, when God asks people to sacrifice things. And there's other times where people are like, I just don't want to carry this anymore. And so it's really at the root of it. Like, that's my question. And I think this is the goodness of God, is even if you set it down because it was just simply too hard to carry, doesn't mean he won't give you something else.
That's true. I was going to
You just may not see the fullness of what that was.
Isn't that a worthy trade though, as well? I mean, I think there is something in humanity that sometimes we want to be able to do it all on our own. Mm-hmm. And when things get hard, we try to carry it all on our own and not trust in others and not ask anyone to share the burden or anything like that, but isn't it also a very worthy thing to be humble enough to say, I can't carry this, I've got to lay it down and allow the Father to take it?
I think yes and no, because I think there's times when yes, and I think there's times when it's that resistance that builds strength. And sometimes you need to build the strength so you can stand in the resistance. So I think it's a little bit of both, or situational. That's why I said at the very beginning, like, it's such a nuanced conversation because one answer is not the right answer for everybody or every situation or every moment.
Right.
Like, this all comes through relationship and trust.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. I think about a topic I know nothing of, by the way, powerlifting, and how people will max themselves out to failure until they cannot carry something, like they cannot pick it up, but they'll come back a couple days later and do it again. But there's strength that has been in putting it down when they know that they've reached their limit. And I think there's a lot of grace. You hit the nail on the head. Like, there's so much nuance to this, but I do think sometimes in having to put down something that's not serving you or that is too heavy for you to carry, it doesn't mean it is like the nail in the coffin. You'll never see it again. But sometimes super necessary in order to regain the strength to pick it back up or to carry it a different way.
Sure.
There's so much we could talk about with this.
Yeah, it's a great conversation. I would love to hear some like listener input either in the comments or hop on the Discord and share something about some of these, like, I'm sure almost all of our listeners have a story of some time in their life when they set something down unsure of what to do with it, and I'd love to hear what happened with that.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, until then, I think we'll wrap it up and we'll see you next time.
See you guys. Thank you for sticking around. Listen for new episodes every Monday and Thursday. Find us on all social media platforms by searching for Market Mystics. Don't forget to follow and subscribe. Visit upperroomcd.com where you can find more information about the hosts, projects, and guests. Go deeper by booking a coaching appointment focused on redefining identity and wealth in your life. See you next time.